Thank you very much for the invitation. It's my second time in Budapest, and the weather could not have been much better than this. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for the invitation. Thanks to share and to Zumtobel to make this possible. And I think in all these topics we heard this morning about heritage, about structures and technologies, this is something that brings another maybe twist and discussion on the table to talk about how certain technologies in other fields and disciplines can transform a field that is so much embedded in our everyday culture, in our everyday lives. That also, we as architects always have to look for the current or let's say the languages that we are using to create spaces that speak of today and that actually are witnesses of our current state of the art, technologies, research, and also understanding how we want to construct our future. I would like to share with you a certain obsession on surfaces, which is all about, of course, the envelope of our spaces that we live in. Surfaces that are talking about the way they transform information or they deliver information. Surfaces that talk about the structure and the construction of the surface, that have time-based aspects like before and after or before and behind a surface. They tell us about haptic and sensorial qualities and of course the materiality of the surface itself. A very personal obsession that starts my understanding of surfaces comes with these patterns that we all get every day in our mail. It's something that goes back about 100 years, which comes from a certain efficiency in administration that creates a very clear border between private and public about, let's say, information camouflaging and information exposure. And this obsession happened because I think when we look at architecture, it's also something like an envelope. It encloses a space, it has windows, specifically I'll show you in a second, where we have these address windows that make a certain delivery very precise and very kind of direct. At the same time, all this information that is carried on has a very clear strategy about being delivered to the right person. And everything that's somehow on the way needs to be controlled, and this is something that we today experience much more, let's say, in an ephemeral or invisible way when we talk about data veins, about how our private information is controlled, leaked, exposed, and where our boundaries of this kind of negotiation of privacy and being public is negotiated. These patterns were developed in Berlin around late 19th century. That's at least the research results by digging into this whole topic. And supposedly it was developed by a company called Berthold, who was at the forefront of font development, also Hebrew language fonts, for example. And it was a printing house in Mehringdamm in Berlin. This building was destroyed later on, and the company went bankrupt in around 1986. But Erich Spiegelmann, who is a meta design founder and also a guru when it comes to types and typologies, he got the whole archive and told me about these catalogs from around 1913, where these camouflage patterns were already offered as LED stamps to clients who wanted to camouflage certain information. Now, when you get your letters, your salary slips, your PIN numbers from your bank, mostly they come either as envelopes, so when you hold it against the light, you cannot read what the letter says, that's the idea. Or you get multiple forms when you get your PIN numbers, so by printing at the front, you get kind of the echo through the carbon paper or the pressure sensitive papers on other layers. The idea is that you can write the original and the copy and the copy and the copy at the same time, or the shipping slip and the invoice at the same time. When you think back, and I think most of us still remember typewriters and carbon papers where you can write the shipping slip, the invoice, and so forth at the same time, efficiency in administration. Now, also with these multiple layers, and this, what I see here, is not showing up here, so I don't know if this is a problem. Can you move the screen forward? Let me see if I go all the way back, if that helps. No, so this is a frozen screen. But basically, what you know as, until we see the images back on the screen, what you know as these envelopes and multiple slips, it's a very clear camouflage, confusion of either letters, numbers, graphic patterns, sometimes words, sometimes just a very confusing camouflage pattern. And I'm wondering, is something happening or not? No, it's not moving. Where's the media department? Huh? Oh, okay. Now it's working. Okay, perfect. So this is what you see here as LED stamps from the company in early 20th century. These are the envelopes that you get when you open them. This is what you receive. The multiple forms. These are the pin numbers. Again, you print on the first page, it echoes on the other ones, and only the one who opens it in the end gets the personal information. This is a shipping slip, for example, envelopes. I'm collecting these for the last 15 years. I have about maybe 300 different patterns. You see the camouflage patterns on one side, or very clear stripes on the other, letters, numbers, words, logo companies, so you can also get this personalized. There is no rule how confusing or how clear or how dense they have to be. I think it's kind of a trial and error process, and of course also a customization. So this phenomenon or this object data protection patterns is something that kind of caught my attention a couple of years ago. And by looking at this kind of metaphor of enveloping, of creating this boundary between inside and outside, I was interested in this layer that negotiates between these two conditions. And by taking these patterns and enlarging them, making them from 2D to 3D, from small to large, is what I would like to show you today, and bring them to an architectural proposal. This one here is printed on carpet and made as an installation for the Berlin Gallery, Berlinische Gallery, which is the Museum of State Berlin, a couple of years ago. It was a carpet and also allowed you to sit on it. That changed the space acoustically. But maybe more important than the carpet were these 3D prints that you see on these pedestals on the right side. These were the same patterns, but interpreted in a three-dimensional way, in different ways, either extrusion, two patterns running through each other, layering of the same pattern and fusing them in different ways. And the rule was that from one elevation, they always had to still look like the original pattern. Here you see some of the examples. This one here maybe is the most clear one. You see on the left side the numbers 5, 7, 9, 9. This is a found pattern. And then by rotating the cube a little bit, and this is just basically an example of an endless array of these confusing patterns, you get a three-dimensional skeleton that becomes a spatial proposal. By now looking at this as a kind of reading device, I want to show you some of the next steps, how to enlarge this into a real space relating to our human scale. This one was an exhibition design for Autostadt Volkswagen on mobility and sustainability, and it was somehow a mesh that was something in between maybe an artificial forest and a structure that embedded a lot of technology, and each part could be changed, is constantly updated according to the latest researches and discoveries when it came to mobility and sustainability. And in this case also for Volkswagen, of course, it means it's a serious topic, and also there are always these traps that you can fall into. We are in a culture of uncertainty what sustainability and the right decisions for our future can mean. When you go into the next step, this is a dining hall in Karlsruhe. Also this kind of pattern and grid in a three-dimensional way abstracted a building within a forest context. This one here became cage that also has the same qualities on the inside and the outside becomes really a three-dimensional environment. Also the color or the surfaces envelope, again, from the roof to the structure to the ceiling, it's all one surface that continues, or one color that envelopes you. In this case, we also were able to construct this in timber and then added a polyurethane coating, so you really get this continuous surface around the building. On another layer, this is the courthouse in Hasselt in Belgium. Timber again on the outside, but a concrete structure on the inside because we're sitting on a parking garage designed by West.H, who did all the landscaping around the train station. And the building was the result of a competition that we worked in a collaboration with SHAREarchitects and A2O Architekten from Hasselt. And we collaborate on this project on many levels, on the exterior, on the urban scale. This was the result. There were two winning teams. Ours was this one. There's another high-rise that comes basically where we are taking the photograph. And the courthouse divides basically three programmatic elements. The lower part on the right is the courtrooms, the tower are the offices, and the cafe and canteen on the top. And the front part is part of the Department of Justice of the University of Hasselt. Hasselt developed its cargo area around the train station, and this is a phenomenon that we see everywhere in the world now. Industries are changing, technologies are changing, but there are kind of leftover areas very close to the city center. And of course, we wanted to echo somehow this bold trusses of these areas, which is somehow the heritage of that time, and we translated that into contemporary building. At the same time, also, Hasselt offers us with a nice, let's say, metaphor of trees, because Hasselt comes from hazelnut trees. And in the logo of Hasselt, we have two trees, which already is not just one element, but it talks about a community. It's already two. There's a dialogue. And when you look at the skyline of Hasselt, and I'm not sure if West.H knew about this or actually discovered it as well, we have always two high-rises from important periods of the city. So there are two towers of the Gothic cathedrals from the Gothic times, which was one of the golden eras in Flandern. Then we have the two towers of the 60s, which was the 20th century growth industry of Limburg area. And then the new area also was planned by West.H, who did the overall master plan with these two towers sitting there. And so we are building, or we were building one of these two towers. You see these two elements in the front, the skyline in the back, and here's some references to maybe the old industrial structures, the steel structures, the trusses, all of that kind of echoing in the new building. And here, the building that grows, where all the three elements of the building grow into one unit and have this new silhouette offered for the city. We also can see some of the views of the interior in a second. Where the entrance area and the interior is basically designed by SHAREarchitects from Hasselt. You see the entry and also the canteen on the top, where we have this view over the city. I want to jump also into products, because when you, and I'll show you this later on also, when you kind of create a certain image that seems to echo somehow the identity of a city, or has a certain, let's say, captures a certain moment of hope, future, curiosity, you might also end up as part of the logos that Belgium translate into in international marketing. And here you see the beer label, which also have our elevation as part of the iconic buildings that always kind of capture an important moment in Belgian history. Then let me show you how these structures, which were mostly like structures for an elevation of a building, also can become more spatial. And in this case, I'm showing you three projects from Georgia. And the Georgian projects that we were involved with are basically happening all over the country, very acupunctural interventions, mostly in a period where the country was extremely developing, Then there was a moment of maybe a little bit reflection, and again, now Georgia has an incredible dynamic, a young generation who's looking forward, very international connected. The best club now happens in Georgia. The wine culture changed. Also tourism changes. The discovery of the nature is a big impact. And all of these infrastructure projects, most of them are infrastructure projects, were important and necessary to create a network of mobility, to create entry points, to also create an architecture that for many people is the only thing they see by going through Georgia, because it has a very important connection from Turkey all the way to Azerbaijan and the Caspian Sea, and therefore we were also asked that some of these architectural projects along the highways or the checkpoints will be not just functional buildings with no care, but also each of them have a certain recognizability and create, let's say, an identity for that space or for that place. So one of them is Gori. It's a rest stop here that has, of course, gas station, but also farmers market, arts and crafts market, and a supermarket, which is only happened in the last 10 years, basically. And what's important to understand is that Georgia built these kind of stations already where there is no highway yet. But these buildings really bring a certain infrastructure, for example, these cultural spaces for arts and crafts, also where you can learn about the culture of the area. And then, of course, at some point also the highway comes, but it's a long kind of process and a strategy that activates certain parts or like updates certain parts of the country, even if a certain development like the highways might take more time. There are 2 highway rest stops on each side of the highway. And also by understanding how important these infrastructures were and these kind of interventions of new contemporary architecture to an area which is quite remote and maybe hasn't seen a lot of development in the last like 30, 40 years. For example, with this one here, when we were there for the opening of the building, we were already told that 3 or 4 couples asked if they could have their wedding party after the ceremony in the rest stop. And I think that's quite a touching moment for a lot of people. The wedding is one of their most important days in their life. So having that in a rest stop and in our rest stop, of course, is a great honor and a compliment. Another building that is installing an infrastructure along the passing through the country is this rest stop here in Sarpi on the Black Sea coast. And it's the checkpoint between Turkey and Georgia. In this case, it's a building that doesn't really look into the dividing of 2 countries, which usually a border is, but actually in the bringing together of the 2 countries, to creating a place that is more of a meeting place rather than a separation place. And we wanted to express that in a building that offers a lot of poche space, a lot of program terraces to overlook the city, sorry, not the city, the beach and the sea, that has meeting points and conference rooms, which was part of the program. And also here you see that the beach is a very popular beach. You can swim on beach all the way to the border. Then it's a little too steep on the Turkish side. But it's not a place where you're afraid of. It's a place that actually welcomes you and wants you to connect with your neighboring nation. On top of the checkpoints, you have conference rooms, and from the conference rooms you can overlook the sea. You have, of course, shopping, but you also have meeting rooms that you can rent for weddings, for conferences, and viewpoints when you go up the tower and overlook that beautiful area. And here are some pictures of how checking through works. I don't really know much or many other countries that actually welcome or say goodbye in such a joyful and beautiful way as Georgia felt it would like to deal with their visitors and also their own citizens, of course, when they leave and come back. Another kind of starting point for a large construction, which was the port of Lasica, north of Poti. The Black Sea is a very kind of shallow sea when it comes to the Georgian coast, and in order to actually have a larger port that is important for the industry and for the industrial, let's say, handlings of things. This was an area which was better for creating a larger harbor with a city around it. At that time, it was planned for 500,000 people. This was the plan when President Saakashvili was still in power. And the starting point of marking this development was this pier with a sculpture, which was somehow a lighthouse to overlook the sea, but also once the city was built, to look back onto the skyline of the city. Now, things changed. The structure was built, but the city did not happen. And now it's maybe one of the most lonely public spaces that was supposed to be, a popular destination point of a large city. But this loneliness also has a very special quality. You can see how fishing, can be a very contemplative way to spend your afternoon. The pieces were built in Turkey. They were shipped on the sea, onto the coast, onto the beach, basically, and then put together and created this beautiful landmark, this structure in the sea that's now longing for the future to come, or is sentimental about the visions of the future that happened. And jumping from this one, and you can also, with each project, see the echo of these patterns and how we are trying to deal with them in a three-dimensional way, how to create a space that is somehow open, porous, has these fringes, that is not sealing like an envelope, how we developed different strategies to deal with these patterns in a three-dimensional and larger scale way. And I would like to jump into the Seville project, which brings a lot of these aspects together in a very complex way when we talk about heritage, when we talk about technology, when we talk about how it activates the everyday life of the city of Seville. We won this competition in 2004, and it took about 7-8 years for it to build, to go through different processes, to deal with landmark issues, to deal with structural complications and complexities, and also how the city itself changed its understanding of cars, pedestrian life, archaeology, and so forth. In the beginning, the competition in 2004 asked for a parking in the basement. There was a parking already started to be constructed, but there was so much archaeology which was important to keep and to create a window into the history of the city, that the whole competition afterwards changed that attitude. Also, at that time, the city wanted to become pedestrian and introduce more subways and tram lines. That somehow got delayed, and cars came back after a while. But in the end, the long-term goal is to actually create a pedestrian-friendly downtown and to make it kind of also pollution-free when it comes to fumes from cars. So in the very heart of the maybe largest medieval downtown of Europe, you find this Plaza de la Encarnación, which was the place for the market until maybe 1950, 1970. The city grew very much after the 50s, and so the market, which was sitting basically where the Metropol Parasol is, was too small to feed the whole city. So that had to move out of the city center, and all of a sudden there was availability in the center. Basically a gap, because nobody knew what was the right decision for this space. The place was never really a plaza. It was always an institution. There was a monastery before, then the monastery grew. They ripped out more city fabric. Small facades in an alley all of a sudden became facades for a plaza. Then the monastery was taken away, and you see how central that building really sits in the very fabric of the city. So it was always an institution who defined that space, the very center of Seville. And the situation when the competition started was this hole 6 meters deep. The perimeter walls for the parking garage were built. And after digging out all the ground, they found Roman mosaics. They found basically markets from the Roman times. At the founding of the city, they found fish tanks with bones, about 300 oil lamps, and etc. So this is when the whole idea of the parking garage stopped, and the question of what is the urban space for the 21st century? How do we want to celebrate our community with a building on that side, or with a public space on that side, was in question. This was the market after the monastery was demolished, and you can see it was somehow a city within the city. The lower part was demolished in the 50s to create the endpoint of a bus line, and the upper part was demolished in the 70s because it was too rotten. I think today we would try everything to keep that historic architecture. In the 70s, it was more important to get rid of it and to create a parking spot for the center of the city. So this was the situation for about 30 years. In the late 80s, there was already an idea to create a plaza with a very small market hall just for local food supply. And then the competition actually in 2004 asked for a new vision. And it wasn't meant to be a competition for realization. It was then called an ideas competition without having the pressure to find the solution for that site. So the first phase was anonymous, and they selected 10 different projects which were all completely different, from a jungle to a huge Centre Pompidou to a minimalist plaza with 3 high-rises. All kinds of possible ideas developed. And all the 10 finalists were invited to Seville, present their work to each other, present their work to public forums. All the documents, the posters, the designs, the texts were all online. And then everybody could start discussing about the possible scenarios for this site. And I think this process was important because there was no competition which was anonymous and all of a sudden there's this one solution. It was a process where everybody could follow the decision making of that space. There was a guest book where people could comment and discuss with each other, and our scheme was the most let's say enthusiastically discussed. We could actually follow quite clearly where we were not sensitive enough, where we could push a little bit more. And of course, this gave us also a boost to improve our design scheme for the final presentation, the second stage. But I think, in a context like this, which is so rich in its historic importance, to have a solution that is growing with a discourse has, of course, much more support than a surprise drop sculpture that comes from somewhere, even if it might have been looked exactly the same. But it's important to understand that there's also a learning curve happens on both sides, and this is a dialogue that actually is very important. Now, I'm guiding you through the design process that when we were looking into this scheme felt was important for the city of Seville. In our reference to the historic relevance of Seville was not by echoing an historic architecture, but actually by looking at why Seville is so important. And it was basically when our European culture was modernized, revolutionized through the Islamic import. So the idea of innovation, of let's say somehow renewing the heritage was the anchoring to the historic references. Now, by looking at this site, and I was in Seville with my parents in '92 for the World Expo, I remember it was very hot and shadow was basically the greatest gift of all. So by offering shade for a climate that allows you to be on the outside was basically the guiding design idea. So we created different shapes of roofs that had to be, the load had to be concentrated on very specific points where we were allowed to go into the archaeology. So that's how the shape basically developed. So we had this floating kind of cloud shading device, and then that was brought down on these very specific sites that were allowed to have foundations after all the research was done by the archaeologists. In the first phase, and I'm showing you also how the structure developed and changed, the first ideas competition moment, we thought it would be this kind of bubble which was perforated, so there was a certain light shadow effect. Then in the second phase, we worked with Arab engineers. That was difficult, to argue and also how to structurally solve this. So we created a steel frame with these pallets that were also perforated, which I didn't really like so much, but this was basically what we came up with for the second phase. And I'm happy that also the jury said we should look into this canopy again and to the parasols and see what's possible. So the next step then was how to bring the structure back into the surface, and so we created this mesh, which was basically impossible in 2004 to calculate and to control by the computers. And then the next step actually was jumping from the skin to construct the skin into constructing the filling and leaving the skin away. So the skin is this invisible skin now that defines basically the borders of this orthogonal grid that we now constructed. And this was also a very clever move because we could easily adapt the heights and the dimensions to different stakeholders. Landmark says lower here, maybe higher here. Structural engineer says we need more span here, less weight here. So it was a very elastic possibility to react to all these conditions. Then, of course, the arguing and the references to the local importance were references here for a neighboring plaza with these huge trees, or the beautiful undulated stone roofs of the cathedral on the same height basically as our parasols, and the structure of the cathedral, the inside, as the space-defining element. Now the design was the roof with the stems going down, but then the program layered from bottom up. So we had the archaeology on the basement, then the food market on the ground floor, an elevated plaza as the roof of the food market, but also becomes another public space, and we have different activities on different times of the day. The market opens very early, closes at 3. The restaurants are open, they might open around noon, they're running till midnight. The archaeology is open in the afternoons. The Parasol, you can go up till, I think, midnight. So different areas have different activity time frames, and that makes it quite interesting. Here you have the beige, which is the timber, and the darker parts are steel or concrete because of earthquake behavior and so forth. But then going from this very easy-looking model into the construction was quite complicated, and you see how step by step we try to get close to that. We worked with Finforest Merck, and timber was not the first solution, but we looked into steel, timber with polyurethane coating, glass fiber reinforced concrete, and with each selection process into earthquake behaviors, cost development, and so forth, the timber with the polyurethane coating always was the winning solution. And you see the production processes, timber comes from Finland, also bonding technology, the joints were glued into the timber. This is maybe another important innovation factor here, maybe one of the largest bonded buildings, bond technology buildings at that time, and also one of the largest timber buildings. You see a cut through one of the elements, the steel rod in the middle, the glue around it, then the laminated timber and the polyurethane coating. Then shipped to Seville, coated outside of the city center, brought on the structure and the construction site, and then put together 44,000 different joints. The steel and concrete elements where the elevators are had to be there for span reasons or earthquake reasons, but then all the rest is this timber with the polyurethane coating. So step by step, this was put together, and then once the building was done, you can see its relationship to the context from above. It has this kind of transparent, very light look. And then in relationship to the historic context, you get this dialogue of, let's say, a more, organic park-like idea versus the historic structure around it. And then when the sun hits it, that's going back to the very original idea of the shadow as the animating and most important element that we brought to the site. At noon, it looks like this. It's a grid, but a couple of hours later, it might look completely different. So also that changes over the time of the day. It hits itself, of course, and creates very beautiful graphics on the side. It projects down onto the neighboring buildings or creates very different moments during the day. But what I wanted to show is also how it really arrived in the city. After it was built, some views from the top. You overlook the city. It's open till midnight. It sits there in the very heart of the downtown. So we finished it in 2011. This was also the moment when Podemos and the whole, let's say, Indignados movement happened to discuss about the future of the country and the future of their of their cities and economies. Of course, there were also some people who didn't like it so much. It was the Catholic Church mostly during the way when we built it and before it was constructed. But then the year after, it was on the cover of their Semana Santa, so it cannot be so bad. It also works very well for Semana Santa. It advertises it in a very specific way. Also for Christmas markets, it works. Schools build it as their crib around Christmas, so you see Maria and Joseph there sitting underneath it. And Semana Santa the week before Easter. The stages and the stairs, of course, offer a beautiful view, and this is what you have around the week before Easter. These very heavy loads with these figurines, 20 men carrying it, breathing, very special music, a very special moment. Then, of course, you have these elevated plazas and different programs, flamenco, political discussions, also manifestations, why maybe tourism is not so great. On one hand, it actually creates attention. At the same time, also, it has all these side effects that we know. And all of that happens in Seville now, again, back at the very heart of the city. This was the Podemos moment in 2011. This is when Podemos was founded on Plaza de la Encarnación, on Las Setas. Even the logo about change used the Seville project as their main image. At that time, you could also discuss there, and each stem of the Metropol Parasol became kind of a program. One was the kitchen, one was the Wi-Fi zone, one was the check-in for certain workshops. You could even sleep there, which is now, of course, not possible anymore. This is basically how it looks on a busy summer evening. But also it works for Latino pop in different medias. It works for hip hop. It works for also cheesy Latino pop, that's the elevator cabin or on the rooftop. It works for Bollywood songs, and it works for Swiss Beatrice Egli pop songs. Miss Spain wanted to become Miss Universe and took pictures on the top. It did not work. Also this year, beige is supposedly the coolest color. They took pictures for Harper's Bazaar on the project. New Balance found inspiration for their soles. Public viewing is also part of the activation of that plaza. Cars like it, Mercedes-Benz use it as their advertising, but constructed is, I think, is a 3D model. But BMW was there to take pictures, and also Jeep was there to take pictures. VW actually moved it in different context, or Renault liked it for their new product. Then, of course, people use social media, and it's the place where people also connect. You're here, you're there. It works on dating apps like Tinder or Grindr. It was on the cover of Lonely Planet for Seville, and also was named the #1 spot to travel to in 2018. Now, of course, tourism also is a problem. We know Airbnb culture, is a danger to the rents that we are paying to the hotel as we know it. So, of course, also these kind of buildings need to be seen in the light of these consequences, and I think also that's part of the side effects that we need to discuss when we talk about these kind of projects. Then also Red Bull uses it, gay pride or cartoon festivals. It turns into fashion. Of course, there are all these products that come with becoming the new iconic image for Seville. Calendars that you can buy on the streets, street painting. It all has that, and of course it also has echoes somewhere else. This is an Indian sports show on television, so this is somehow maybe also capturing a moment where these structural solutions might appear in different scales all over the world. You have interior for lounges or shops, and sometimes they also appear on competitions. and even furnitures like this. On a very small scale, and these are just examples that basically also friends sent me to add to my collection of these kind of strategies. But what I wanted to show you, and talking about different scales from coming from these very small patterns even into a larger urban context, now let's go back into a micro scale to finish my presentation here. It's a product that is on the market now, and I was asked if I would agree to have Metropol Parasol on the advertising and on the packaging. And I didn't really know why it was important. Yes, it was wood, and the cat's best pallets were also made of timber, but I didn't know why it was so important. I'll show you a video now in a second, and I always wanted to show a cat video in my presentations. But they had different designs and had guests, like test customers, and always this motif was favored as the best cover for the product. So now we have a video. Can we play it, please?
Die Natur hat einen schlauen Weg erfunden, Feuchtigkeit aufzunehmen. Nach diesem Prinzip haben wir Cat's Best entwickelt. Die pflanzliche Katzenstreu aus technologisch veredelten Aktivholzfasern, die Feuchtigkeit und Gerüche aufnehmen und einschließen. Und so auf vollkommen natürliche Weise bis zum 7-fachen ihres Volumens binden. Kompakt, ganz leicht zu entfernen. Und so hygienisch, dass die Streu bis zu 7 Wochen im Katzenklo bleiben kann, bevor der nächste Komplettwechsel fällig ist. Eine rundum saubere Sache. Cat's Best. The power of nature.
So you see, we jumped from different scales. It was the structure that was always key in a very minor micro moment, also in urban environment. It all comes from a very personal obsession, but it guides us through all kinds of aspects, and maybe that's why I have so much fun doing architecture. There's always something new to discover, and we are not afraid of, let's say, bridging out to different disciplines, different products, different realities. And I would like to end this lecture with thanking you for coming and inviting me to this fantastic conference. Thank you.